For decades, farmers around the world were told the same story, delivered in different accents but always with the same confidence. Adopt this system, invest in this technology, follow these recommendations, and everything will work. The message didn't come from one place. It came from universities, agribusiness companies, consultants, trade shows, white papers, demonstration plots, and government-backed programs. It came wrapped in charts, case studies, and carefully selected success stories. It didn't sound like marketing. It sounded like inevitability. This was not framed as an option. It was framed as progress. The promise was seductive because it was logical. If farming could be standardized, measured, optimized, and controlled, then variability would disappear. Risk would shrink, yields would rise, costs would stabilize, nature itself would finally become predictable. And for a while, it seemed true. Yields did increase in many regions. Operations scaled, efficiency improved. Farms that adopted modern systems often outperformed those that didn't, at least on paper. The numbers looked good enough to silence doubt. So farmers kept going. They upgraded machinery. They adopted new management protocols. They integrated precision tools. They followed input programs designed to remove uncertainty from the system. What mattered was not intuition anymore, but compliance. Not observation, but execution. Not resilience, but optimization. And if something didn't work, the explanation was always the same. You didn't implement it correctly. You didn't go far enough. You didn't optimize enough variables. The solution was never to question the system. The solution was always to double down. This is important to understand, because farmers didn't adopt these systems out of ignorance. They adopted them because the promise was backed by authority, by science, by institutions that had spent decades positioning themselves as neutral, objective, and data-driven. Saying no to that promise didn't feel cautious. It felt irresponsible. Who wants to be the farmer ignoring science? Who wants to fall behind while everyone else modernizes? So the industry moved together, in the same direction, with remarkable speed. Fields became larger, machines became heavier, inputs became more specific, decisions became centralized around data streams instead of field-level signals. And the soil, slowly, was reframed. No longer a living system to be interpreted, but a medium to be managed. No longer complex, but configurable. No longer adaptive, but responsive. If something was missing, it could be added. If something was excessive, it could be corrected. If something was inefficient, it could be optimized. That was the promise. What almost no one mentioned was the trade-off. Because systems that are optimized for efficiency tend to lose tolerance for error. They work exceptionally well under expected conditions, and poorly when reality deviates from the model. And reality always deviates. Weather doesn't follow averages. Biology doesn't respect schedules. Soil doesn't behave like software. But those truths were inconvenient, because they complicated the narrative. It was easier to believe that variability was a problem to be eliminated, not a signal to be understood. So farming became quieter, not in sound, but in feedback. Systems were built to smooth out irregularities, to correct deviations before they were noticed, to maintain output at all costs. And in doing so, they masked the early signs of stress. Yields stayed acceptable, margins tightened quietly, input dependence increased gradually, nothing broke dramatically, there was no single moment of failure. And that is why the promise survived. Because slow failure doesn't look like failure. It looks like normal business pressure. Like rising costs, like tighter margins, like needing just a little more precision next season. The promise was never tested against reality all at once. It was tested incrementally, and incrementally, it passed. Until it didn't. But by the time the cracks became visible, the system was already deeply embedded. Farms were structured around it. Equipment investments depended on it. Supply chains assumed it. Advisory services were built to support it. Walking away was no longer an option. Questioning it felt dangerous, so the promise remained intact, even as its outcomes drifted further from what was originally sold. This is where the story really begins. Not with failure, but with belief. Because once an entire industry believes a system is inevitable, it stops asking whether it is actually working. It only asks how to make it work harder. What farmers were sold was never just a set of tools or practices. They were sold a worldview, a way of seeing agriculture that promised clarity where there had always been uncertainty. A framework that claimed complexity could be reduced, variability controlled, and biological systems made predictable through the right combination of inputs, technology, and management protocols. This worldview did not emerge by accident. It was built deliberately, over decades, by aligning economic incentives with a specific interpretation of science. At its core was a simple assumption that efficiency is always good, and that anything inefficient must be eliminated. In this model, diversity is messy, redundancy is wasteful, adaptation is unpredictable, uniformity, on the other hand, is clean, standardization is measurable, control is scalable. So agriculture was redesigned around those principles. Crops were selected for consistency, not resilience. Rotations were shortened to simplify logistics. Soil biology was treated as a black box, assumed to respond obediently to chemical signals. The field became a system to be tuned, not a relationship to be managed. This shift was subtle, but profound. Instead of asking, "What is this soil telling me?" the question became, "What input is missing?" Instead of observing long-term patterns, decisions were made season by season, application by application. Instead of building buffers against uncertainty, farms were optimized to perform under expected conditions. And expected conditions rarely exist. The selling point of this worldview was not just productivity. It was certainty. Certainty that outcomes could be predicted. Certainty that risk could be engineered out of the system. Certainty that deviation was a technical problem, not a structural one. That certainty was reinforced everywhere. Research trials were conducted under controlled conditions. Success stories highlighted best-case scenarios. Failures were framed as execution errors. The narrative was consistent. If the system didn't work, it was because it hadn't been applied correctly. This mattered because it shifted responsibility. The system itself was never questioned, only the farmer's ability to implement it. Over time, this created a powerful feedback loop. Farmers who succeeded were showcased as proof. Farmers who struggled were told to refine their approach. And the system remained above scrutiny. What made this worldview especially persuasive was that it often worked, initially. Short-term gains were real. Early adoption frequently delivered higher yields. Labor efficiency improved. Management decisions felt more rational and data-driven. But those gains came with conditions. They assumed stable weather patterns. They assumed consistent access to inputs. They assumed soils would respond linearly to intervention. Those assumptions were rarely stated. They were simply embedded in the design. As long as conditions stayed within the expected range, the system performed. And when conditions drifted outside that range, the response was not to reconsider the framework, but to increase intervention. More data, more precision, more inputs. Control became the answer to every problem. Yet biological systems do not reward control indefinitely. They reward balance, redundancy, and adaptability. When those qualities are removed, performance becomes fragile. This fragility was not obvious at first, because it did not show up as catastrophic failure. It showed up as increasing sensitivity. Fields that once tolerated delayed planting no longer did. Soils that once buffered excess rainfall began to saturate quickly. Crops that once recovered from stress now required immediate correction. The system worked, but only if everything went right. And farming is not a profession where everything goes right. The worldview farmers were sold left very little room for error. It replaced resilience with optimization, and adaptability with compliance. Every decision became interconnected. Every mistake became more expensive. Every deviation carried greater risk. And yet, the narrative remained unchanged. The solution was always to refine, not rethink. To optimize further, not step back. To add layers, not simplify. This is how complexity grows unnoticed. Not through innovation alone, but through accumulation. Each new solution is added on top of the last, addressing symptoms without questioning causes. Over time, farms became highly sophisticated systems that required constant attention to maintain equilibrium. This was framed as progress. But progress that only works under perfect conditions is not progress. It is dependency. Dependency on inputs. Dependency on technology. Dependency on uninterrupted supply chains. Dependency on stable markets and predictable weather. What was sold as empowerment slowly became constraint. Farmers were given tools, but also obligations. Flexibility was replaced with procedure. Experience was sidelined in favor of prescriptions. And because this shift happened gradually, it was rarely challenged. You do not question a system while it is still delivering acceptable results. You question it when the margin for error disappears. That moment did not arrive all at once. It arrived quietly, season after season, as variability increased and systems became less forgiving. And by then, the worldview had already done its work. The system did not collapse. That is the first thing to understand. There was no single season when everything failed. No dramatic turning point that forced immediate change. What happened instead was slower, quieter, and far more dangerous. The system started to lose tolerance. At first, the signals were easy to dismiss. Fields required more precise timing than before. Inputs had to be applied within narrower windows. Margins began tightening, even when yields stayed stable. None of this looked like failure. It looked like normal pressure. Like the cost of doing business in a competitive environment. So farmers adapted the only way the system allowed them to. They refined their programs. They upgraded equipment. They added more monitoring. Each adjustment solved a problem temporarily, but also increased dependency. Soils became less forgiving. Where once a delayed operation resulted in minor yield loss, now it meant significant penalties. Where once variability was buffered by soil structure and biological activity, now it translated directly into stress. This was not because farmers were doing less. It was because the system demanded more precision than reality could consistently provide. One missed pass, one weather anomaly, one supply delay. The system punished deviations quickly and efficiently. This was most visible in soil behavior. Infiltration slowed, compaction effects lingered longer, nutrient response became erratic. Soils that once absorbed mistakes now amplified them. Instead of correcting imbalance naturally over time, the system required immediate intervention. And when intervention was delayed or insufficient, recovery took longer than expected. This is what fragility looks like. Not collapse, but sensitivity. Farmers noticed they were working harder to maintain the same outcomes. That inputs delivered diminishing returns. That yields depended increasingly on perfect execution rather than inherent system strength. Weather variability made this worse. Rainfall events became more intense. Dry periods became longer. The margin between too wet and too dry narrowed. Systems optimized for averages struggled under extremes. Fields drained quickly until they didn't. Soils held moisture until they couldn't. Crops tolerated stress until suddenly they didn't. Each anomaly required correction. Each correction increased cost. Each cost reduced flexibility. What had been sold as resilience through control revealed itself as fragility through optimization. The response was predictable. More precision agriculture. More sensors. More data points. The assumption was that the problem was insufficient information. But the problem was not lack of data. It was lack of buffer. Biological systems survive uncertainty by absorbing shock. By distributing risk across diversity, redundancy, and adaptive capacity. The modern system had systematically removed those buffers in pursuit of efficiency. Diversity had been reduced, redundancy eliminated, variability treated as error. When stress increased, there was nowhere for it to go. Instead of dissipating, it accumulated. Farmers found themselves managing not just crops, but risk exposure. Every decision carried higher stakes. Every deviation threatened outcomes. This created a new kind of pressure. Not physical, but psychological. Farming became less intuitive and more procedural. Less about reading the field and more about following protocols. Less about adaptation and more about compliance. And when things went wrong, responsibility felt personal. If yields dropped, it wasn't a system. It was timing. It was execution. It was management. The system itself remained unquestioned. This is how fragility hides. As long as failures can be attributed to individual decisions, the structure escapes scrutiny. But patterns were emerging. Similar problems appeared across regions, crops, and operations. Farmers who followed recommendations precisely still struggled with increasing sensitivity. Systems behaved similarly regardless of operator skill. That is not coincidence. That is structure. When multiple operators experience the same failure modes independently, the problem is rarely individual. It is systemic. Yet systemic problems are difficult to acknowledge because they require systemic change. And systemic change threatens investments. Machinery sized for a specific approach. Supply chains optimized around uniformity. Advisory models built on prescriptions. Walking away from the system would mean admitting that decades of progress may have been misdirected. So instead, the system tightened further. Even more precision, even more optimization, even more control. This created a paradox. The more the system tried to eliminate risk, the more sensitive it became to it. The tighter the tolerances, the higher the penalty for deviation. And agriculture, by nature, deviates. The break did not announce itself loudly. It whispered through rising costs, tightening margins, and increasing anxiety. By the time the problem was undeniable, it was deeply embedded. And that is why so many farmers feel trapped. Not because they lack options, but because every option seems to require undoing years of accumulated decisions. The system didn't fail all at once. It failed gradually, by demanding perfection from an environment that never provides it. By the time the weaknesses of the system became visible at farm level, the system itself was already succeeding elsewhere. This is the part that rarely gets discussed openly. The system did not fail everyone. It failed selectively. Upstream, it performed extremely well. Input companies sold more products, more precisely targeted, more frequently applied. Equipment manufacturers moved larger, more complex machines with higher margins. Technology providers embedded themselves deeper into daily decision-making. Advisory services expanded, not contracted. The system generated activity, and activity looks like progress. Every new problem created demand for a new solution. Every new solution justified another layer of complexity. Nothing in the structure rewarded simplicity or resilience. Everything rewarded optimization and dependency. From a business perspective, this made perfect sense. A system that requires constant adjustment creates recurring revenue. A system that tolerates error does not. So solutions were designed not to eliminate problems, but to manage them continuously. This was not necessarily malicious. It was structural. When incentives align around selling inputs, technology, and prescriptions, the system evolves in that direction regardless of long-term outcomes at farm level. The costs, however, are distributed downward. Farmers absorb the risk. Farmers absorb the volatility. Farmers absorb the consequences of system fragility. And because those consequences appear slowly, they are rarely traced back to the structure itself. Instead, they are framed as individual challenges. Weather was bad, markets shifted, timing was off, management could improve. Each explanation is plausible on its own. Together, they obscure the pattern. This framing is reinforced by how success is measured. Short-term yield is visible. Long-term soil resilience is not. Quarterly sales numbers are tracked. Decadal system stability is not. Research trials run for seasons, not lifetimes. Balance sheets close annually. The system optimizes for what can be measured quickly. And what cannot be measured easily is often ignored. This creates a powerful illusion. As long as yields remain acceptable and failures are framed as exceptions, the system appears functional. No single actor is forced to confront the whole picture. Universities focus on specific variables. Companies focus on product performance. Consultants focus on implementation efficiency. No one is rewarded for asking whether the overall direction is sound. And asking that question carries risk. Questioning the system challenges investments, reputations, and careers. It implies that some of the progress celebrated over decades may have come with hidden costs. That is not an easy conversation to have in an industry built on confidence. So the narrative persists. The solution to rising complexity is more sophistication. The solution to fragility is more precision. The solution to dependency is better management. Rarely does anyone say, maybe the system itself is over-engineered. This persistence is also cultural. Modern agriculture has been framed as a triumph of human control over nature. Admitting limits feels like regression, like abandoning progress, like returning to uncertainty. But uncertainty never left, it was only hidden. The system did not remove risk. It redistributed it, from the environment to the farmer, from the system to the operator, from structure to execution. This redistribution makes failure feel personal. When outcomes fall short, farmers look inward, not upward. They adjust, optimize, and work harder. That effort is admirable. It is also exploited, because a system that relies on individual resilience to compensate for structural weakness will continue functioning, at least for a while. Until it doesn't. The most uncomfortable truth is this: the system continues to be sold because it works just well enough. It delivers sufficient output to justify itself. It generates enough success stories to maintain credibility. It produces enough data to appear scientific. And the failures are dispersed, slow, and difficult to aggregate. There is no single crisis. There is no clear line between success and failure. Only a gradual narrowing of margins. A gradual increase in sensitivity. A gradual loss of autonomy. These are not metrics that trigger alarm bells. They are metrics that get normalized. This is just how farming is now. Margins are tight everywhere. Risk is part of the business. All true, and all convenient, because as long as pressure is normalized, the system remains unquestioned. The system does not need to be perfect. It only needs to be better than the alternatives appear to be. And alternatives require imagination, patience, and structural change. Those are harder to sell than inputs and machines. So the system persists, not because it is optimal, but because it is entrenched. And the deeper it becomes embedded, the harder it is to see where it ends and necessity begins. At this point, the question is no longer whether the system has weaknesses. That much is clear. The real question is what happens next. Because continuing down the same path is not neutral. It is a decision, and it is a decision with consequences that compound over time. The system farmers were promised was built on the idea that problems could always be solved through better control. More precise inputs, more detailed prescriptions, more sophisticated technology, but the problems now emerging are not control problems. They are structural ones. They are the result of systems optimized too tightly, with too little tolerance for deviation. Systems that perform well under expectation, and poorly under surprise. And surprise is no longer the exception. Weather volatility is increasing, market instability is becoming normal, supply chains are less predictable, input costs fluctuate faster than planning cycles. These conditions expose the limits of systems that depend on perfection. The response so far has been to push harder in the same direction. To refine what already exists. To assume that one more layer of optimization will finally stabilize outcomes. That assumption is dangerous, because systems that lack buffers do not become resilient through refinement. They become more brittle. The future of farming will not be decided by who adopts the most technology, but by who builds systems that can absorb shock without constant correction. That requires a different way of thinking. Not abandoning technology, but repositioning it. Not eliminating inputs, but reducing dependence. Not maximizing short-term efficiency, but restoring long-term flexibility. This is uncomfortable, because it challenges the dominant narrative of progress. It suggests that some forms of advancement may have traded resilience for control. That some gains came at the cost of autonomy. That some efficiencies were borrowed from the future. This does not mean going backward. It means recalibrating what forward actually means. Forward may look less uniform. Forward may look less optimized. Forward may look less impressive on spreadsheets. But it will feel different in the field. Systems that tolerate delay. Soils that buffer excess. Operations that adapt without panic. These are not romantic ideals. They are practical necessities in an environment where uncertainty is increasing, not decreasing. The hardest part of this transition is not technical. It is psychological. It requires accepting that certainty was oversold. That no system can eliminate risk. That complexity cannot be fully engineered away. It requires moving from a mindset of domination to one of negotiation. From forcing outcomes to shaping conditions. That shift does not happen overnight. And it does not happen uniformly. But it begins with a simple recognition. If a system only works when everything goes right, it does not work. It merely delays failure. The promise farmers were given was not malicious. It was incomplete. It assumed a stable world. It assumed predictable inputs. It assumed controllable variability. Those assumptions no longer hold. Continuing to act as if they do is the real risk. The future will favor systems that accept uncertainty and are designed around it. Systems that prioritize resilience over optimization. Systems that fail slowly and recover quickly, rather than collapse suddenly. This is not an argument for less intelligence in farming. It is an argument for a different kind of intelligence. One that respects biological limits. One that values redundancy. One that leaves room for error. Because error is not the enemy of agriculture. Fragility is. Farmers were promised a system that would remove uncertainty. What they need now are systems that can survive it. And the longer that truth is ignored, the more expensive the lesson becomes.